Students are often at the forefront of movements like this.
And we've seen movements like this on university and college campuses before for other reasons.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, we have. Yeah.
There were encampments both during the Occupy movement of the sort of earlier in the century of 2011, and then there were the shanty towns and sit-ins outdoors of the anti-apartheid struggle in the mid-1980s. So this has happened before. It's not a new tactic.
And how would you compare what's happening now to the encampments against apartheid, for example?
Well, I think this has spread much more quickly because of social media. In the mid-'80s, there really wasn't social media the way there is now. So I think it's caught on much more quickly. Also, interestingly, in the mid-1980s, there wasn't initially the kind of repression there was here. So it didn't make the news quite the same way. They had to sit in outside the offices in Columbia and then at Berkeley for weeks before anything, before there's any kind of attempt to try to arrest them. So there wasn't the dramatic stories of repression that called the movements to the attention of other campuses all over the country.
There was a much more universal condemnation of apartheid in South Africa, and in this issue we see a lot more fracturing and calls for government leaders to support Israel, government leaders saying they will support Israel.
But this movement, because of the pressure on college presidents and the popularity of the cause, has made university administrations much more eager to get rid of the protests and to show that they're being tough. So there's been a kind of erosion, I think, of free speech on campus compared to the 1980s or even in the 1960s.
Well, talk to me about the 1960s and the protests.
I think this compared to the 60s is smaller. We're talking about the late 60s when there was a mass anti-war movement, even into 1970. And the benchmark I use is May 1970, which was the largest mobilization of students in American history.
Against the war in Vietnam.
Yeah, the war in Vietnam, after President Nixon, who came into office pledging to had a secret plan to end the war. So the idea is he's going to end the war. Instead, he expanded the war into Cambodia. And that caused a lot of outrage on college campuses. And then as part of those protests, there were some really militant protests, nothing like that has gone on today, where on several, over probably about 2 dozen campuses, ROTC buildings were torched. That hasn't happened. And one of the campuses where that happened was Kent State. And a few days later, a kind of very rigid conservative Nixon supporter, James Rhodes, who's running for re-election to governor, sent in the National Guard to suppress the protests. And the students came out anyway, and they ended up, 4 of them got killed by the Guard and 9 were wounded. So this movement today, first of all, you have to remember that the war had escalated in Vietnam in 1965, 5 years later, and there's a lot of feelings of frustration that the war is just dragging on and on. Contrast today, the movement is pretty recent. The Gaza war is just a few months old, and so you can't really compare it to something going on for years. And those images of dead and children and civilians comes back to people instantly on social media, and it's helped to make this spread. So again, social media has really, the war in Vietnam was televised too, but not the kind of instantaneous kind of thing that you got with social media. It's a symptom of how far to the right we moved as a country, where nonviolent protests can be sort of demonized in this way.
Where do you think things will go from here?
The encampments are not interfering with the university's ability to keep doing its work, teaching, and in fact, we could argue that it's the protests, the encampments are enhancing a university's role in terms of being able to engage in dialogue on all of these issues, not necessarily only giving space for the protesters' message, but also creating events to hear other perspectives. And that's really what universities ought to be doing. So that's what I hope will happen and could happen. I fear that it will not.
They had the saying in the 60s in this movement, the issue is not the issue. Meaning, it's not that the issue isn't the Gaza war, it is, but there's a deep issue here in terms of the university, which is that the governance structure is really not well designed to hear student voices. They know that their voice isn't being heard, and they're just being told to take a hike. And so they are taking a hike, they're encamping.